Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe. Let's talk about those guys. Folks, welcome to the Baseball Brewhaha. We're bringing the noise today. We had some big news drop last week, so we got to talk about it. But before we do that, I have in my possession some new swag,
You do.
courtesy of your household.
My household.
Yeah, and it's maybe a little tough to see. This is a mug. It's got some cool like baseball stuff on it. And also on it, it has a QR code that does what? It shows you some historical fact from baseball history. Today's, which I was unaware of this. Adam, maybe you knew this. 1979, there was an umpire strike. And on May 19th of 1979 is when that umpire strike ended. They had replacement umpires, which, recent memory of the NFL, how well that went. I imagine it was something similar. But did you know that, Adam? Did you know there was an umpire strike? I feel like Dad hasn't had to have known about this situation. We were not born
Yeah.
yet, so
Yeah. I mean, now that you are bringing it back to the consciousness, I'm remembering that I'd heard that it happened. I don't know much of anything about it. There was a
mhm.
players' strike just a couple of years later in 81, but the umpire strike not as burned into the baseball memory.
Yeah. Yeah, just reading slightly about it, it sound like similar type of thing. Pension, benefits, salary, like kind of all those deals. No time off. Baseball, I mean, you don't get days off in baseball. Real, I mean, you do, but not many. So it's demanding to be a major league umpire. So it's no joke. But
I'd be curious to know some of the details in the umpires CBA, collective bargaining agreement.
well, I know from external what it feels like is we will never correct an umpire who is incorrect. That's what it feels like. Am I right or am I right?
Well,
Because they
there's
got
got to,
all these scorecards out there now,
yeah,
and some of these umpires are consistently terrible in terms of, you know, obviously terrible is relative, but consistently not good.
I'm sure that's part of their agreement is like right now,
Mhm.
the way umpiring is set up, that there's no way that the umpires union is going to agree to like pay or demotions or whatever based on these scorecards.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, speaking of umpiring is I mean, so I will say this. As much as there are scorecards and there are some bad umpires and that kind of thing, umpiring is hard. Adam, you've done some umpiring, not at the professional level. Um, but and then I'm coaching my son's baseball team, and we're rec league. We've got brand new, inexperienced umpires. Overall, they do a great job. We have one of our catchers has been doing better, but struggled to catch the ball. So the umpires taking just pitches just straight in the gear. So now they got to deal with oh, what pitches do I dodge and not dodge? And then I still gotta try to call a strike on like in rec league, the strike zone's a little bigger, so you're making all these judgment calls on and you're trying to jump out of the way to not get drilled in the thigh with I mean it's 40-mile-an-hour fastball, but still doesn't feel good.
Yeah. Well, my experience is adult softball umpiring.
Hmm.
Not my favorite.
It's a tough crowd, you know.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks they should not be in this league and should probably be called up to the majors. And so the emotions run on that gasoline right there.
Yeah.
Hmm. So, well, and we got serious things to tend to. I wore clothing to represent our discussion. We got the
Yeah.
Field of Dreams.
Yeah. Shoeless Joe.
It's not a Reds jersey. It's the
No.
closest I have, but you couldn't tell that from the top. Could be a
You
Reds jersey.
it looks with the blue undershirt, you look like you're wearing Expos uniform right
Oh,
now.
there you go. Yeah, we had P Rose play for the
Yeah.
Expos.
Yeah.
So sure, I'll go with that. But re lifetime bans for several, not I mean Shoeless Joe and Pete Rose are the big names. But several players had lifetime bans lifted or removed due to the fact that they're no longer living. Just was handed out here just last week. What are your thoughts about this? I've thought about it some, but I feel like your thinking is next level. So I gotta go. I wanted to know where you're at.
I don't know if it's the next level about this topic. I haven't really thought about it much at all, other than when I first heard it, it's sort of like, what's the point?
Well, the point is that players like Shoeless Joe and Pete Rose could now I mean, they can't be elected via the ballot, but the Veterans
Yeah.
Committee could choose to vote them in. So that's into the Hall of Fame. That's the big deal.
Well, yeah, I know. I know that is the point, sort of, Yes.
Mhm.
But really, what's the point of that? Like what? So they
Yeah,
get elected, then what? Who's that for? You know?
yeah. I mean, I have similar thoughts. And part of this is like, um, you know, as baseball fans, like there's certain guys that are just that they they're not really your guys. Or I mean a lot of players are not my guys, but like Pete Rose is not a guy that I like cheer for. I didn't watch him play. He was before my time. Um, but like listening to interviews and stuff like that, like he just his vibe is not like I don't I'm not inherently like a Pete Rose fan. And so that colors my view of this whole thing. But if I'm 10 years older or 15 years older and I watched Pete Rose play and he was my guy, like I mean it would be like if maybe maybe to try to compare it if like Griffey was in a similar boat and then suddenly he were allowed to be elected in the Hall of Fame. Would I think differently about that than as a fan? Like I understand what you're saying. At the end of the day, we're talking about like a museum, we're talking about a Hall of Fame, and we're talking about I go to my job and I parent my kids and you know, I do the stuff that I do, whether or not Pete Rose is in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Well, and when it comes to voting them in, I mean these guys are maybe along similar lines as like Barry Bonds and Alex Rodriguez. Um,
Which they haven't been banned, have they? Right?
no, well, that's the thing. They haven't been voted in
Right.
and they haven't even been banned. So
The- yeah.
are like Pete Rose and Joe Jackson, whose like sins were apparently so egregious that they were officially banned. Are
Hmm.
the writers gonna vote for those guys? Like, really?
Yeah. Well, it's not a writers though now. It's veterans
Yeah,
committee.
yeah.
So
So
it's players.
is the Veterans Committee gonna vote in Barry Bonds and A-Rod and Roger Clemens?
I I mean,
Nah.
I think you have in one, yeah, it's a little hard to say because of, I don't know who sits on that veterans committee, if it's all Hall of Famers or not. Um, we can talk about that issue another time. Because I heard some former players make some really excellent and interesting points about the steroid era. But we're not talking steroid era. We're talking these guys. It's an interesting thing because we're all aware. I mean, I think if you follow any baseball history, um, there have been many moral failings of different colors. I mean, I don't mean like racial colors. I mean a variety of different types of moral failures.
Hmm.
And this is kind of fits in that realm, though it's different because it's like on the field affecting the game type of a thing. So there's and back when those lifetime bans were handed down for the Black Sox, that coincided with baseball making a concerted effort to want baseball to be a clean game and to be viewed in a positive light because it wasn't positively in terms of character of the people playing. It was not viewed a very positive light in the early 1900s. So this coincided, and the commissioner at the time basically said, we have to like really come down hard to stop this in its tracks because gambling, this type of gambling in particular, where you're actually gambling on the games you're playing in, was a big deal at that time. And they wanted it out of the game. And so they wanted to make it a real, not just like, oh, 10-game suspension. They wanted to cut it off. And so then Pete Rose gets kind of subject to that started back in the 1900s. Obviously, I think the same issue, and I mean, you could say even today
Yeah.
that, I mean, I'm reading comments from watching videos on YouTube where it's like, where there's some real questioning of, does that umpire, for example, have a have money on this game? And they're impacting because the umpiring is so bad in favor of one of the other teams, there starts to be these questions. And so I think the question is as real today as it was in 89 and it was in, you know, 1919. So
And possibly even more relevant today with the sort of the prevalence of sports betting
yeah.
and
Well,
even
you had the Shohei and his
yeah,
interpreter thing. That was just a couple years ago.
yeah, and it hasn't been that long ago since an NBA ref,
Yep.
was imprisoned um
Yep.
for betting and fraud, all this
Hmm.
stuff, betting on games and players especially college players, point shaving. Like, we're not talking about this is a
Hmm.
1909 problem. This
Hmm.
is a problem today, and the penalties are stiff. Like the NBA
Hmm.
penalties when the guy like bet on himself or whatever a year ago, the Raptors guy who rarely played. But like I mean, just like you're out,
Yeah.
you know? And I think the same thing would be true in baseball. So, like, when we're talking about lifting these lifetime bans, I just go back to what's the
Mm.
point and who's it for?
Right,
And
because it seemed like the punishment is essentially like, look, you're not going to see the Hall of Fame in your lifetime. You're not going to get to experience that during your lifetime. And I can see on the major league side just saying like it's over now. We can acknowledge their accomplishments of what they did as a player. But yeah, to your point, yeah, carry on. Who is it for?
yeah, well, and I wonder too, I mean, I suppose lifting the ban does open the door because if we get to a point or if the voters or whoever's, whether it's the writers or the Veterans Committee, however they're making those determinations, if it gets to a point where Hall of Fame election is more along the lines of museum and less about character, which
Mhm.
it's sort of like they're trying to do both at the same time. And so if it's more about like um the greatest players on the field
Mhm.
and sort of like put the blinders on for all the other things, then you're gonna have Rose and Bonds and A-Rod at some point elected to the Hall of Fame, and by lifting that ban, you open the door for that at some point. But leaving the ban
Mhm.
on then creates this like uneven. So, okay, we're going to put Bonds in, or we're going to put A-Rod in, but we're not going to put Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe because of some arbitrary ruling.
Right. Yeah, it seems like all both the steroids and the gambling situation is a different sort of infraction in which you're the actions that you're taking are actually impacting what's happening on the field. Whereas, if you think about, you know, drug use or domestic violence, like I'm not saying those things should be ignored. But in a sense, they're not affecting what's happening on the field in terms of creating a level playing field. Um, and so that's why you have like a guy like Cap Anson, who is probably the single reason why black players were not allowed in Major League Baseball until 1947, is still a Hall of Famer. You know, I mean, you could make an argument that it impacted what happened on the field. I think it's a legitimate argument to make, but
Hmm.
it's not the same. It's different, sort of different era, unfortunate set of circumstance, that whole thing. Um, but he wasn't the only guy too. So I mean, he gets a bad rap because he kind of initiated the whole thing, but he wasn't the only guy. So let's not throw him completely under the bus by himself. Um, but yeah, it affects what's happening, the product on the field and what's happening on the field. And then, where particularly with the steroids, where it comes into plays, you have all these guys that are playing the game clean. And who's to say that didn't affect their career? You know,
Yeah.
um, you know, I heard said multiple times where it was like if you had a pitcher come in like a relief pitcher, he's trying to make his way into the big leagues and he's facing some guy who's taking steroids, or, in the case of, gambling on the sport or whatever, you're going into a game that you don't know is fixed in some fashion, and you end up with a 15 ERA in one outing and get sent back to the minors and never get called up again. Like, I mean, there was a relief pitcher that tried to sue
Mm-hmm.
Major League Baseball with the Astros trash can banging thing that came out because he had an outing that he got pummeled in Houston, and it basically, like, I think it, like, he didn't get called up again after that outing. So,
Yeah, well, and I think too about things like betting. What if a Hall of Famer now,
mhm,
someone who's in the Hall of Fame already, it comes out that they were betting on games that they played in, and it was like a lot, like a lot.
mhm.
Then what? What do we do with that?
Right. Yeah.
We
I
got
mean,
we
that's
got
a
we got a
mess.
mess.
We got a mess. We got a real mess. So, yeah, I mean, in one sense, yeah, it's fortunate that none of that has come out. Um, and you hope that there just wasn't. Sometimes you think, is that real? You know, feels like guys could have, should have, or not should have, but could have been easily gambling on games, but we don't know, and that's okay. We don't need to spend time in the speculation world. We don't have anything. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, but that's part of the problem with the voters and the voting system now. Once you get into sort of like the steroid era, like Bonds
Mhm.
was never uh formally, like he it, he never was suspended. No one
Mhm.
ever proved that he used steroids. Um, so what are we doing?
Yeah.
Do I think he used steroids or some sort of performance enhancer? Sure. But so were a lot of
Mhm.
players, and
Mhm.
how do you draw the line? And
Yeah.
so for a
Well,
lot of the
so
writers, it's they're like making judgments.
so then it makes me think, it are basically like Bonds, Clemens, Sosa, McGuire, these guys that, had they had the statistics that they had without being linked, Rafael Palmeiro, without being linked to um, performance enhancing drugs, Alex Rodriguez, all these guys, had they had those numbers, they'd be in the Hall of Fame,
Yeah.
every single one.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder, is their treatment sort of akin to, is it the Shoeless Joe Jackson and the Pete Rose treatment of of the steroid issue, you know, because it's sort of like, you know, we're going to keep you out of the Hall of Fame, is kind of sort of like the only, is that the only, maybe you have something off the top of your head, is that kind of the only punishment that you can kind of mete out, that actually, if you want to kind of take a stand and say, we don't want this in the game. They have, obviously they have testing and stuff like that now, but more consistent testing, I think. So we're told. If you're wanting to get it out of the game, isn't that following the same prescription of the Shoeless Joe and Pete Rose?
Yeah. Yes, because you've got the if it happens and you get suspended and eventually you're out of the game. Um,
Hmm.
and then as far as the way it's treated in terms of Hall of Fame, it's different right now. Well, now it's not, but prior to last week, it was different because you have a ban where they're not eligible at all.
Hmm.
And on the steroid side, there's no official ban, but they're not getting voted in.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So, I mean, not to make the same comparison in terms of race here, but that's kind of basically like what happened with Cap Anson and black players. There was
Hmm.
never a rule that said a team could not have a black player. It
Hmm.
was just sort of a gentleman's agreement. Well, gentlemen, handshake agreement that they wouldn't. And so here you have with steroids, there's no formal with these particular, and there's not even a particular thing that says if you use steroids, you can't be elected into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
There's nothing written banning or, you know, but it's another, it's not unanimous, but it's certainly a gentleman's agreement of sorts. Um, and I've heard it come up as well as like the kind of the, what do you call it? The voting criteria or how they vote. There's like a character clause in there that was
Hmm.
put in there by Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was historically incredibly racist and against blacks
Yeah.
playing in the major leagues. It's like it's a comedy of terribleness, is what it is.
Yeah. Well, and this is where we're at right now with the character piece. And so as long as we have writers making decisions about the Hall of Fame that have a character component to it,
Mhm.
then this will continue to be a thing.
Yeah.
Steroids, gambling, um, treating the, how players treat the media affects
Mhm.
how much of a look that they get. Thinking about someone like Kurt Schilling, who
Mhm.
is like, I guess you could make a case for Hall of Fame, and you can make a case for not, but not many people are making the case for him. Like people in the baseball media aren't running out to do that because of some
Mhm.
of his things that he has said, things that he has done, and the way that he's treated the media. Compare that to someone like Edgar Martinez. I mean, I think he's more of a clear-cut Hall of Famer,
Mhm.
but he was considered on the fringe, but he's like a nice guy.
Mhm.
And so every year you get these like articles on ESPN of like
Mhm.
in-depth writing of why
Mhm.
he should be in the Hall of Fame, or like at least you got people doing the deep dive. I don't see that on Kurt
Mhm.
Schilling every year.
Well, and it's interesting because most of Kurt Schilling's like controversial statements and stuff all happened after his playing career.
Right.
Like, so that's a whole nother like
Yeah.
can of worms where it's like, I never I wasn't necessarily a big Kurt Schilling fan. I thought he was a really good player, but like not I didn't my impression wasn't that he was some jerk to the media. Maybe he was, but most of that's all been after his playing career. So
Yeah.
it's a is it and when you talk about the moral piece of it, when you start throwing that in character clause and whatnot, is like every voter has a different standard. Like they have different things that they think this is immoral and this is not. And And like it's so subjective. It's just you just throw it in there and like, here you go, vote on that. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, the morality is the murkiest. But even if you took that out of it and you said, okay, we're going to do this based on stats and analytics, how are you going to do that?
Yeah, it's still murky. There's
Yeah.
some guys that are obviously clear cut, but where is the line that you make that cut? Because I mean, there's guys in the Hall of Fame that you look at and you go, okay, like,
Hmm.
all right, Harold Baines, okay, right, good player, Hall of Famer. I don't know, you know. Anyway, so um, fun discussion. I don't have a conclusion on Pete and Joe. I actually, we're not going to really cover it. I was actually more thinking about like, I don't know if you saw this. We got 1 minute here, but they did a Pete Rose Day, like right after they lifted it. I'm like, if you're a fan, and what if you're not a big Pete Rose guy, or you don't agree with this, and now you're subject to Pete Rose Day?
That's probably a small problem.
Yeah, yeah, for us who most fans. But anyway, I had that thought, like, what if I'm going to the game and suddenly it's Pete Rose Day, and I didn't agree with that. Oh well. It's another one of those of who does it affect? Why does it matter? I'm going to work tomorrow. So,
Yep, you are.
and we'll be back on it next week.
We
So,
will.
thanks for hanging with us. We'll see you then.